coverage to cryptocurrency, Ashwini Anburajan has done it all. Her wide array of impressive experiences include public policy work, a fellowship with NBC News, and an MBA at Cambridge University. From Cambridge, Ashwini pivoted hard into the world of business. Eventually, she joined what was, at the time, a small company of 90 employees called Buzzfeed. After experiencing the company's takeoff at warp speed, Ashwini, as she puts it, caught the startup bug and sought to pursue her own venture. On this week's episode of Yuptown, Ashwini shares the story of her incredibly exciting career and tells the story of starting her own venture. Plus, she shares the story of being a founding partner of a cryptocurrency fund. I'm Victoria Principato, and this is Yuptown.
So thanks so much for having me.
Really thanks for being here.
I started my career right after college. I went to Brown and I majored in international relations. I needed to compromise with my parents because they couldn't deal with like an English major. You know what I mean? It was it didn't work for immigrant parents. And so I majored in politics and international relations, and it allowed me to take a lot of literature classes because I just really wanted to be a writer. And I did also a master's, not a master's, but a capstone in creative writing while I was at Brown. And so so I had like a really creative bent, and I liked writing and I liked communicating. And so whatever I did, I didn't know how to turn that into a career necessarily, but I think I got very lucky early on. I ended up with a fellowship at the mayor's office in Providence, Rhode Island.
Wow.
And we were writing a racial profiling policy because there were a lot of police. There's a lot of distrust between, and it's funny now when I'm saying this, considering 2020,
Right.
we're working on police, and the minority community's relationships with each other. We built a racial profiling policy, and that was what I worked on the summer after college.
Wow.
And from there, it was the presidential elections. People were running against George W. Bush at the time.
Okay.
And I went to go join this guy named Howard Dean, who was up in New Hampshire. And so I worked as a political organizer for the first part of the elections, and then I came back to DC, and I wanted to be a speech writer. I wanted to do something on the communication side because I wanted to write. And so I ended up getting a job as a opposition researcher.
Oh, interesting. I've had a friend who's done that, and he says it's just like the shows, like just as crazy as you would think.
Yeah, it's just like you're just digging up data all the time.
Right.
And I was good at spotting trends, but it was just like this type of work that demonstrated that I could research, put a story together, get it out to press, whatever. And so from politics, I wanted to move into TV and journalism. And I was more interested, I think, in news and information than I was and I didn't even know how to approach the creative side of it necessarily. So I got a fellowship at NBC News.
You were far out of school at this point. So I feel like getting those kinds of fellowship programs isn't.
Yeah, it's normally designed for people that are straight out of journlism.
Okay.
A master's in journalism. I was unusual because I was very young to have gotten it. I think I was 24 at the time. And I hadn't been a journalist at all, but they valued the political experience so much and some of the work that I'd done that it just opened the doors. And so I found it online. I applied, I didn't know anybody.
Wow.
There was just it was a complete blind process. It opened kind of this next stage of my career where I was writing and producing and researching for the news organization. So you'd spend 3 months at the Today Show, and then 3 months at the Nightly News, 3 months on the assignment desk, which is coordinating all international coverage, 3 months at Dateline or one of the or MSNBC. And I loved the experience. And then after that, I went to go work at the Today Show. I missed politics a lot, and at the end of 1 year at the Today Show, I got a job, which is the job that I walked around NBC News, telling anyone that would listen that I wanted to go cover the campaign trail. I wanted to cover presidential politics. And so they have this special thing for very young people to literally just live on the campaign trail until your candidate wins or loses, pretty much.
Wow.
And so I got very lucky. I covered Barack Obama in 2007, 2008. I covered his entire primary campaign So from August of 2007 through May of 2008, I was on the road with that campaign, and it was a wonderful experience. Like, you get to like follow a candidate around, you're with like a group of reporters, and that taught me how to really truly be a journalist and ask tough
Mm,
questions, like kind of follow the news, understand how things are trending and changing. And I got to the end of that experience and I realized that, like, I was like finished up at NBC, did a lot of work with NPR as well, and realized that like I kind of had this like kind of junction in my path. Like, right, I was gonna be 30 in like a year and a half. And I was like, I can either continue to be a journalist, or I could go into, I love media, like I want to go in, or I could go into the business side of it, because I
mm,
knew things were changing. Like I knew television was changing and it
right.
didn't feel exciting to me. Some people, it's their dream job to be a producer on the TV show, on the Today Show. It was not my dream job, and so yeah, so I had this like kind of crux moment of
Mhm.
like, do I go do something that's new and doesn't seem as prestigious? Digital at the time was not as prestigious. And how do I do that, right? Like, do I
Right.
feel like going to write for a website, which is like I didn't really want to do that.
Mhm.
It just felt like more like there was a bigger potential and opportunity to like go build these things into businesses. And so I decided to go to business school,
Mhm.
and that was how I ended up with my MBA. I got almost a full scholarship to go to Cambridge in the UK.
What an
Um,
experience.
and that was a great experience. It was like a 1-year MBA program, so which is what most of the European programs are.
Mm.
I'd always wanted to like kind of study and live in Europe, so it felt like a really exciting opportunity. And so I just decided to take it and go for it.
So from getting your MBA, what was your first venture? And can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I did my MBA, and I have to say I was pretty blind going in
Mm,
because I just didn't have the business background that
right.
everybody else had. And I think it's challenging for folks that don't have traditional business careers. I said, like, if I'm going to do B school, like, then let me like really go get a job in business, like, right, let me do this. And so that took a lot of it took a lot of effort and a lot of time. I got startups just seemed more fun
Right.
for me than working at a big corporation. It felt kind of terrifying to go work at a bank or McKinsey or some place like that,
Right.
just because like I just didn't I did, it just felt scary, right? Like, and I didn't have like a lot of confidence in my own skill set. Like, right. I knew I'd gone to school for a year, but what did that really mean? I just knew that I wanted to work in media companies. Like that was what I really cared about. So my first job out of school was in London, and it was putting West End plays online. So we were taking like theater in the West End, putting it online, selling it into the educational market. It was a really good first job. Like just kind of gave me a sense of like how to build business models, how to understand and think about like kind of things, understand how do we sell and what do we do next. And from there, I came back to the US and went straight to San Francisco because I thought I'd, go to the West Coast, like figure it out. And it was really funny. I just couldn't get a job. I mean, I think the economy was like still coming back. And I was just such an unknown quantity, I think, at that time, of like this really rich political background, but then like no real life skills. And
Mm,
then,
yeah, San
and so
Francisco is like very tech heavy too. So I would imagine
yeah,
that was
exactly. I
a challenge.
knew very little about tech, I would say. And I actually ended up getting a job back in New York, and it was a company called Outcast Media, and it put TV screens at gas stations. It was just like so not like exciting. But like I just knew it was a proper business job. Like I had a good title. Like it was actually really tough, like financial modeling that you had to do. So
Mhm.
it taught me things that I never thought I would learn, like, things I needed to learn.
Right,
And it was
like a
good.
quantitative skill set that you just
Yeah.
really needed, and I don't know, I think I would imagine the challenge for you might have been trying to focus on one environment. When you're in politics, you're kind of involved in so many different realms, and kind of being forced to focus on one ecosystem in a business. I don't know, I find that challenging as well, so, I'm sure that was probably hard for you too.
Yeah, it was definitely, it took, I mean, I'm a more of a general interest person anyway. And so it
Right.
it it took a lot. It took a lot of focus, it took a lot of energy. Stuck it out for a year, and then, started looking, and I through some old politics contacts of mine, got a role at BuzzFeed. And so I was
Oh,
an early employee at BuzzFeed. No one had heard of it when I went there. Everyone was like, "What? What is this place called?" And then it was just a rocket ship. And they gave me the job because I was a journalist and I had a journalism background. Because they
Interesting.
wanted someone who could communicate the data. They were sitting on a ton of data. They were gathering data from other websites. They had this like viral algorithm that was pulling data from like all over the internet and finding out what was trending and allowing people to build stories, right? And so we had
Mhm.
this data network and it was tracking the reading habits when I joined of about 200 million people. And my job was to grow the network,
Mhm.
you know, and then also figure out how do we make all the information that we're sitting on what people are reading, what they're doing, how do we make it interesting? How do we make it compelling? How do we tell a story about it?
Tasty videos.
Yeah, I know, right? That was like, it's so funny. Like when I think about it, like, just sort of the evolution of BuzzFeed, like I remember that brand getting born. I remember when they like first started using like a lot of video on the site and like all this stuff, like, before like the innovation of that company of just like literally like figuring out that people like to click on a list and like they like to click on like specific numbers in
Yeah.
lists, like odd numbers do better than even numbers, little things of like information. And that's what happens when you're sitting on that level of granularity and then trying to aggregate it, understand it, and turn it into like something into actionable insights. And I think that's the brilliance of BuzzFeed as a company, that it was the few companies I've ever encountered that could take their data and turn it into something that like actually grew their business in a significant way. And for a media company, very few media companies have done that well. And yeah, it was exciting to play a role in that. I joined when before they had 90 employees, and by the time I left, they had 650.
Oh my
And that
gosh.
was in like a 2-year period.
That must have been
Um,
exhausting.
yeah, I mean, it was intense. We were starting to get to this plateau moment, and I remember thinking, it's been really good. And I remember looking back on my Facebook like page, like for the year or whatever, that you get that year in review.
Mhm.
And I remember I was like, this is nuts. All I do is post about BuzzFeed. All the pictures are only with BuzzFeed people. Like a startup can become your life, right?
Oh,
And it's the
yes.
culture of it is so powerful.
Mhm.
And if you're young enough, at the time, like it just can be all consuming. And so for me, it was like, oh, wow, like this is like, I remember thinking consciously, like, I need to take a step back. And at that point, I'd already started thinking about that I really wanted to start a company. I had the startup bug, from the time I went
Right.
to business school, and I really just wanted to try something new. I went from BuzzFeed to Hearst, which was a BuzzFeed investor, and
Mhm.
obviously owns like very prominent titles, right? Like Cosmo and Esquire and Elle. And it was a really nice experience because they gave me sort of financial stability and essentially like an entrepreneur in residence role to
Mhm.
come in and just try experimenting. Like, what could I come up with? What could be interesting? What would move the needle for their business
Mhm.
on the data and information
That
side?
must have been a dream job for you, like a playground.
Yeah,
That's
and I was very clear with them, like I wanted to build my own company, so they
Mhm.
understood that like the things I were doing, like I could potentially like turn out as IP, and they would be the first customer, and that was the relationship I had with them
Wow.
throughout the journey of my own company. So I built a company called Open Up, and it allowed consumers to share their data directly with brands. The originally, and at the time that I started the company, it's the end of 2014, early 2015. There were a lot of other people that were playing in this space. It was like starting this conversation around the idea that our data is valuable, it means something, it's the new gold. And
Mhm.
so when I launched my company, about 6 other startups also launched at the same exact time,
Oh,
all trying to pay people for their data and like figure this market out. And the reality of like, there's in business school, you learn about something called Porter's five forces, right? Like, and
yes.
it's the idea that there's like all these like different factors that come in
Yeah.
to influence a business. And one of the things we don't think about a lot, but it's actually the regulatory environment and government
Yes.
and what role it plays. And the irony of what we were trying to do, a lot of people were like, Facebook won't let you do it, Google won't let you do it, or it's just too hard to do. It's not about that. It's just about like, this is such it actually data ownership, it actually has to come down to regulation. Like, and if you look at a presidential candidate like Andrew Yang, he talks about a data dividend, right? Like it's a really great marketing line, but a data dividend is the idea that you're getting paid a little bit every year because everyone else is using your data. It's almost like stock. Like, right? It's
Mm,
like owning a piece of stock, and like you're getting paid for it from a set of
interesting.
companies that are paying into a pool because they've used your information. And it really is like, what was interesting about working on that as a startup idea and wanting to turn it into a business was that was like I think one of these naive mistakes of like not understanding like how is the world set up to allow this to happen, right? Our
Exactly.
government's moving in this direction, are people moving in this direction. One of the more interesting things I did while I had the company was that we would give like people stuff for their data, right? Like the first thing we ever gave them was a Cosmo magazine subscription.
Hmm.
And then a ticket to a conference that Cosmo was holding because Cosmo was our client, like, right, we're working with hers. And so we would like, we got all these people to like download a browser extension and give us their browsing history in return for getting a magazine subscription and going to a conference. Like, like this is like my experiment number one.
Right.
And then it was kind of like, okay, we're sitting on this like ridiculously rich data set. Like, what do you do with it? Like, why is it interesting? What makes it different? So we started working on the idea of attribution. Like, can you prove that what people are reading, how they're reading news, how they're reading information, what they're seeing online is actually getting them to change the way that they purchase? And so the company kind of, and this happens with startups, like you have this big, big, big grand idea. And then you need to like kind of narrow in to figure out how to turn it into a real business model. I think that there's two types of founders, right? There's the ones that really, really are dreaming big, but they can figure out how to make it small enough from day one where they can take that and move it forward.
Right.
Or sometimes you can just be like, have a really simple idea and it grows naturally and it evolves over time. Or the third is kind of where the bucket I fell into, which don't be in this bucket, where you just have a really grand big idea and think you can build in that great big way. And it doesn't like the two just don't go together. It was a tough thing to do. I made a lot of mistakes as a founder. I had no idea how hard it would be to raise capital, especially as a woman and a woman of color. And just like how bruising the VC game is. VC and raising money is not easy for anybody. I just want to say that. I know and I understand that and I've seen it. It does not, like, whether you're a white man or a woman or, a robot, like it's hard to raise money. I was ready to give up after 2.5, 3 years. Like I was ready to kind of call it quits because you just get to a natural point where you're like, okay, it's not growing anymore. There's no point. So I was ready to sell the company, got an acquisition offer. And it wasn't like a super lucrative acquisition, right? Like no one was going to become a millionaire. And I'd raised angel money and I had some clients and, we had this little business like that's, if I'm being really honest, like that's what it is. Like we had a business. It was nice. It was never going to go anywhere unless we like found a way to like, raise $2 or $3 million. And just as I was about to give up, I got a call from 500 startups in San Francisco.
Okay.
And they said, hey, so-and-so passed your deck on. We're going to start a data track and we need data companies. And like, do you think you'd be interested? And I was like, well, I just had this acquisition offer. And they're like, well, why don't you they were like, if someone's really interested in acquiring you, they'll call you after the program. Like, why don't you come do this? Wow. And I said, okay, sure. Like, and so I decided to take a big risk and go out to SF. Brought a new co-founder with me, just decided to give it a go. And when I got to SF, to the program, I met the same exact resistance that I'd had in New York.
Really?
We don't like the market. Like, we don't think you're going to be $1 billion company, like blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh my God, like this, what did I waste my time for? And so, but at the same time that this was happening, it was 2017 and it was what is happening in the cryptocurrency markets right now was happening then. And actually now it's way bigger, but back then it was like, oh my God, what is going on with Bitcoin? What is going on with Ethereum? Back then also there was a lot more money flowing in because it was completely unregulated. And so everyone in my startup community at 500 startups, a lot of some of the founders had Bitcoin backgrounds and had blockchain backgrounds. And they said, we need to do something. Like we need to take advantage of this. And at this point, like I'd been rejected. Like I felt like I was getting rejected by VCs and SF as well, just like I had in New York. I just realized that like, every founder has like a personal runway. And it's not just money, it's emotional capacity to like keep going when things get tough. And I was hitting like a wall. And I said, something has to change. Like, I can't do this again here. So why don't I work on this and see if this helps me raise money? And I'll use this as my last ditch attempt. And it was just one of the most extraordinary moments of my life like came after that year. Like, if I think of two big career moments in my life, it was covering the 2007 2008 campaigns um for NBC. It was working on the Dean and Kerry campaigns, and then it was Bitcoin, and it was starting what we call 22x fund thing. We decided as a group of founders that we were going to get together, pool the equity in our startups, and launch what was called an ICO at the time, which then the initial coin offering, which then
As opposed to an IPO, right?
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And then became to be called a security token offering. What was really interesting was that 2 months before at Y Combinator, a group of people decided to do the exact same thing,
Interesting.
and also in London at Techstars. So what was happening was that a lot of people had this idea all at once. Why we at 500 startups got it off the ground and turned it into something, I will never know. But like that was what happened. Like, we had a bunch of people in different startup accelerators all working on trying to put something like this together and being able to like take time away from their own companies to work as a group. And so I worked with a group of 10 founders, and we convinced all the other founders in our batch to sign term sheets, pool equity, found lawyers, found investors that would back us, and launch our own essential venture capital fund that was like issuing essentially what it was issuing a cryptocurrency backed by equity in startups, and that could be tradable. And the idea was democratizing access to capital, right? It was the idea that we could cut out VCs as a middleman. Instead of founders going out on their own, knocking on door after door, do it as a group and package ourselves together, almost like an index fund. And it was, it's a simple idea, but it was quite complex to pull off. And I didn't have a lot to contribute in the moment, like when I was doing it, right? Like I knew nothing about blockchain. I knew nothing about Bitcoin, but I could write. And so I offered to help with the marketing and the PR, and I offered to write the white paper. It ended up being like this really powerful thing because I ended up becoming the spokesperson for and the face of the fund, and it gave me like incredible exposure, which I'm still grateful for to this day. I ended up winning a residency at the TED conferences, gave a TED talk that's been viewed by like 2 million people, and I think that what inspired people, why the TED talk was inspiring, was because it was the idea that like this ragtag group of founders, like, like there's no difference between us and like any other batch of people that came through 500 startups or Y Combinator or anywhere else. It was just that we had this very collaborative mindset, and we were in the right place at the right time, and we had the will to carry through. We ended up like creating a successful fund. Along the way, I decided to give up my startup and not work on it anymore. I was more interested in the fund, and we issued a fund. We have cryptocurrency that's trades now. You can find it on Open Finance, which is one of the exchanges it's on. It was nothing that I would have ever. I never set out to be an investor. I never set out to work in VC. I just I was a founder that really wanted to get some funding. But what happens is, what does it mean to have a cryptocurrency? What does it mean to have digital money? What does it mean to be able to easily transfer an asset? And I used to say this when we would do roadshows to raise capital for 22x, but I would explain it to people in this way. They're like, well, what's the big deal? Like, why is this interesting? And I was like, well, when you think about the internet 1.0 was a publishing platform, right? Like you take information and you put it online. Internet, like 2.0 is like a bit of a communication platform. Like you can talk to each other, you're broadcasting, et cetera. Internet 3.0 is a value transfer platform. So you're exchanging value across groups of people and between individuals. Like, and it's the simplest way. It's like, I can transfer something to you and you can transfer something to me. And the digitization of that is like sort of just opening the doors of what that represents.
Can you describe what you mean by, like, what does that value mean? Like, what do you mean by?
Yeah, so it's just the idea that like, it's like Venmo. It's like,
Okay.
I can send you something and you can send something back to me. And it represents money exchanged or value exchange for something that occurred in the real world or something that might occur online. And in the earliest versions of the internet, it was very hard to do that. But like that's what Bitcoin and all this stuff is doing, right? Like it's the idea that like it stores the value, and it's also the idea of decentralization. It's more complex than I'm describing it as, but it's a way to simplify it as thinking about this, right? Like that the next versions of the internet are that like we're all a node on it, like we're all a little supercomputer powerhouse. We can all have a piece of the cloud sitting on our computers. We can all be computing for other people. We can all be earning money at the same time that we're doing that, and we can be exchanging like kind of like value with each other. We can be paying each other, receiving money, and like all of these transactions are occurring, and they're doing it in a way that a centralized authority like a government or a bank or something doesn't have to be involved, because there's a level of like kind of like trust is encoded into the network. It doesn't have to be verified by a third party source.
Do you have
Wonderful.
any like final pieces of advice that you want to offer?
um I don't know, life is about a lot of serendipity, and I think it's also a willingness to just really take chances.